Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair at 221B Baker Street, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the flickering embers in the fireplace. The dimly lit room bore a stillness that was rare, a temporary pause in the usual chaos of cases and clients that occupied his days. Outside, London lay drenched in a relentless downpour, the cobbled streets gleaming under the gas lamps. The faint patter of rain against the window accompanied the occasional crackle of burning wood, and in the silence, Holmes allowed his mind to drift through past cases, through unsolved mysteries that still gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Watson sat opposite him, his book open but unread, his gaze subtly shifting toward his friend, noting the distant look in his eyes. He recognized this expression well. It was the look of a man who was not at rest, of a mind that refused to settle, even in moments of quiet. It was only ever broken by the arrival of another case, another puzzle to dissect. And as if the universe itself had conspired to oblige, a sudden knock on the door echoed through the sitting room. Holmes did not move immediately, his mind already at work analyzing the nature of the visitor, before Watson even reached for the handle. The knock had been hurried, forceful but not violent, bearing the urgency of a man who had reached the end of his resolve. The footsteps outside, though muffled by the thick wood, suggested a tall figure, heavy-set but not overweight, a man accustomed to movement, perhaps of a higher class, indicated by the faint scent of expensive tobacco that had already seeped through the door's frame. Holmes had deduced a great deal before the visitor was even admitted, but when Reginald Henshaw stepped inside, there was something in his expression, in the weary slump of his shoulders, that suggested an exhaustion beyond physical fatigue. The man entered, his coat dripping from the relentless rain, his hat gripped tightly in one gloved hand. His breathing was measured, but his eyes betrayed an unease he had yet to speak aloud. His hair, graying at the temples, suggested a man in his late 40s, though his posture and the deep lines on his face made him appear older. The room seemed to shrink around him as he stood there, his presence carrying with it a weight neither Holmes nor Watson could ignore. He stepped further into the light, his gaze darting between Holmes and Watson, as if assessing whether he should even be there at all. Holmes had encountered this type before, the kind of man who had spent his life controlling everything around him, only to find himself standing before someone else, stripped of all certainty. There was an arrogance buried beneath the distress, the last remnants of a man who was unaccustomed to asking for help. Holmes did not need to ask why he was there. The answer was already evident in the man's posture, in the way he clenched his jaw before speaking. Reginald Henshaw's daughter had vanished. Holmes listened, his sharp mind catching every detail as Henshaw recounted the events of the previous night. The dinner had been uneventful, the usual pleasantries exchanged, nothing in Eleanor's demeanor to suggest distress or unease. She had retired to her room as she always did, and by morning, she was gone. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no sounds in the night. Just a door locked from the inside and an open window that led to nothing but a steep drop to the streets below. Holmes observed the subtle shifts in Henshaw's voice as he spoke, the calculated hesitations, the slight tremor that betrayed an emotion he was unwilling to name. There was something more, something that had not been said yet. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto Henshaw's with an intensity that made even Watson shift in his seat. The air in the room seemed to tighten, as if Holmes himself had drawn every ounce of distraction from it, leaving only the weight of truth that had yet to be spoken. There was more to this disappearance, something that Henshaw was holding back. Holmes had encountered men like him before, men of influence who chose their words carefully, revealing only as much as they deemed necessary. But he had no patience for partial truths, a silence stretched between them, the kind that did not beg for words but demanded them. Holmes allowed it to linger just long enough to make Henshaw uncomfortable, long enough for the man to realize that omission would serve no purpose here. There was a moment of hesitation before Henshaw spoke again, a slight exhale as if preparing himself for what came next. He finally admitted that he had enemies, men who might see his daughter as a means to settle a score. He did not offer specifics, only vague mentions of past business dealings that may have left lingering grudges. Holmes, however, was not so easily misled. His mind was already working through the contradictions. A locked door from the inside suggested a departure of her own volition, not an abduction. No struggle, no signs of forced entry, only an open window that led to a drop that no one in their right mind would have attempted. And yet the father sat before him, convinced that she had been taken. There was a crack in the narrative, something that did not fit. Holmes could sense it like a thread unraveling beneath his fingers. He studied Henshaw's face for a moment longer before standing abruptly, reaching for his coat and hat. Watson, already familiar with these sudden bursts of action, rose as well, though with considerably less urgency. The case had already begun to take form in Holmes's mind, the pieces arranging themselves in ways that others might have overlooked. There was something deeply unsettling about it, not in the nature of a typical crime, but in the details that did not align. He had learned, long ago, to trust that feeling, the quiet dissonance of a case that did not behave as expected. And this case, he realized, was already beginning to trouble him. The rain had lessened by the time they stepped outside, though the streets remained slick and dark beneath the glow of the lamps. The carriage ride to the Henshaw estate was silent. Save for the rhythmic clatter of wheels against wet cobblestone, Holmes sat with his gaze fixed beyond the window, his mind a flurry of possibilities dissecting every aspect of the story he had been given. There was a truth hidden in it, somewhere between the words spoken and the ones deliberately left unsaid. He was determined to find it. When they arrived at the Henshaw estate, the house stood tall and foreboding against the night, its presence a stark contrast to the warm glow of the city behind them. Holmes stepped out first, his keen eyes scanning the surroundings, taking in the intricate details that others might have missed. The house was undisturbed, no signs of intrusion or panic. It was almost too still, as if waiting to reveal its secrets to those who knew where to look. Holmes had seen crime scenes before, had walked through houses filled with the echoes of violence and despair. But this place did not bear the weight of a struggle. It felt untouched, eerily preserved, as if it had been waiting for his arrival. Holmes moved swiftly toward the entrance, his mind already sorting through the variables that had yet to be addressed. He had not yet set foot inside, and yet he knew with absolute certainty that something was deeply wrong. Not with the crime itself, but with the story that had been given to him. There were cases that tested his intellect, cases that challenged his logic. But then there were cases like this, cases that gnawed at something deeper, something that would not be satisfied with mere deduction. He stepped inside, his senses immediately attuned to every detail, every inconsistency. The case had begun, and with it a feeling Holmes could not yet name. But he knew without question that this would be the case that stayed with him, the case that he would regret, the case that would break him. Sherlock Holmes stepped inside, the grand but silent Henshaw estate, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. The air carried a peculiar stillness, an almost deliberate kind of quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The flickering wall sconces cast long shadows along the polished wooden floors, their glow barely illuminating the corners of the space. He moved forward with measured steps, each one deliberate, each movement a calculation in itself. Watson followed close behind, though his expression betrayed skepticism. There was something unnatural about this case, something Holmes had yet to name but could feel creeping at the edges of his mind. He was accustomed to crime scenes that screamed their truths in bloodstains and shattered glass. But this house whispered instead, speaking in half-truths and missing pieces. And that, he knew, was far more dangerous. Reginald Henshaw led them through the corridors, his pace quick but uneasy, his body language betraying a reluctance that he failed to mask. Holmes observed the way the man's fingers twitched at his sides, the subtle tension in his jaw as he walked ahead of them. He had dealt with liars before, men who spun tales with enough precision to fool even the keenest minds. But Holmes had also learned to recognize when a man was withholding out, of fear rather than deception. Henshaw was not lying, at least not in the way criminals did. He was protecting something, a secret buried beneath his grief. Holmes knew better than to pry too soon. The truth, he had found, was much like a wound. If one cut too deeply before it was ready to be revealed, it would only bleed into obscurity. They reached Eleanor's room, the door standing slightly ajar. Holmes stepped in first, allowing his gaze to sweep over every inch of the space before even taking a step forward. The room was pristine, untouched by chaos or struggle. A neatly made bed sat against the far wall, its sheets unruffled. A small writing desk occupied the corner, the ink bottle still full, the quill untouched. Everything remained precisely as it should have been, save for the absence of its owner. And that, in itself, was the loudest clue of all. He had investigated enough disappearances to know that a true abduction left behind the residue of force. A torn fabric, an overturned object, something out of place. This room bore no such markings. Instead, it felt frozen in time, as if the girl had simply dissolved into thin air. And yet, as Holmes moved deeper into the room, his eyes found the one thing that did not belong. He lowered himself to one knee beside the wooden desk, reaching a gloved hand beneath the drawer. When he pulled it back into the dim light, a single silk thread rested between his fingers. It was pale, impossibly delicate, yet unmistakably foreign to the rest of the room. Eleanor's wardrobe consisted of wool and cotton dresses, all carefully arranged in the open armoire beside the bed. None bore the kind of fine silk that matched the thread in his hands. Holmes turned it over between his fingertips, his mind already moving beyond the room, beyond the walls of the house itself. This was not evidence of an intruder. It was evidence of something far more deliberate. Reginald Henshaw stood near the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression hardening as he watched Holmes work. Holmes knew that the man recognized the importance of the thread just as well as he did, but still, he said nothing. That only confirmed what Holmes had suspected. This was not a crime of force. Eleanor had left of her own accord. The question was why. Holmes rose to his full height, slipping the silk thread into his coat pocket before stepping toward the window. It had been left slightly open, the curtains shifting gently with the draft. He noted the way the latch had been carefully disengaged, not broken, not forced. It had been opened by someone who knew how to be silent, who understood the value of secrecy. He leaned forward, peering down at the drop below. The cobbled street was a dangerous descent for anyone attempting an escape, but it was not impossible. His mind reconstructed the moment, a figure slipping out into the night, leaving behind a room so untouched that it would fool anyone into believing she had simply vanished. But why go through such measures? Why abandon everything with such precision? And more importantly, why had Reginald Henshaw led them to believe otherwise? He turned abruptly, his coat flaring slightly with the movement as he crossed the room. He had no patience for carefully constructed half-truths. He stepped past Henshaw without a word, moving swiftly down the corridor and into the library at the end of the hall. He had already noticed it upon arrival, a private space filled with books that bore the wear of frequent use. A man's study revealed more about him than any conversation ever could, and Holmes was determined to find the missing pieces hidden within it. The scent of old parchment and pipe smoke clung to the air as he entered. The dim glow of the fireplace cast long shadows across the shelves, making the room feel smaller than it was. Holmes's gaze flickered over the titles, tracing the spines of books that had been pulled from their places recently. He moved to the desk, his fingers brushing lightly over the scattered papers. Then, he found what he was looking for. A small folded note, barely visible beneath the weight of an ink blotter. He lifted it carefully, unfolding it with precise movements. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, bearing the signs of someone writing, in a hurry. He read the words once, then again. A silence stretched through the room, the weight of realization settling over him. James Percival. The name had been spoken once before, but now it carried the weight of something far greater. Holmes had encountered the name in the whispers of London's underworld, a man known for his quiet brutality, his ability to manipulate those around him without ever being seen. He was not a man who acted impulsively. He was a man who orchestrated, who moved pieces across a board long before his opponents realized they were playing, and now his name had surfaced here, in a case that had already begun to pull Holmes into its depths. Watson stepped forward, concern etched across his face as he observed the shift in Holmes's demeanor. Holmes did not speak immediately. Instead, he folded the note, slipping it into his pocket as he turned back toward the door. The weight of the case had changed. This was no longer about a missing girl. This was about something far more dangerous. Reginald Henshaw watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Holmes stepped past him, his mind already moving toward the next step. He had seen cases where men lied to protect their reputations, their legacies. But there was something about this case, something about the way Henshaw hesitated, about the way Eleanor had disappeared without a trace, that made Holmes certain of one thing. This was not about business. This was personal, and that above all was what made it dangerous. Sherlock Holmes stepped out of the Henshaw estate into the cold night air, his coat whipping behind him as he moved toward the waiting carriage. The rain had ceased, leaving behind the scent of damp stone and the quiet hum of the city settling into its midnight rhythm. Watson followed close behind, his brows furrowed as he watched the careful deliberation in Holmes's movements. Holmes had already mapped out his next steps, the weight of James Percival's name now pressing against the edges of his thoughts. This was no ordinary case. There were no random acts in Percival's world, no wasted efforts or careless missteps. If his name had surfaced, it meant that Eleanor's disappearance had been set in motion long before anyone had realized. Holmes knew that time was against them, that every passing hour meant another piece of evidence fading into obscurity, another layer of secrecy closing in around them. He climbed into the carriage without a word, his mind already reconstructing the sequence of events that had led them here. The ride through the city was silent, the wheels clattering against the wet cobblestone, the flickering street lamps casting shifting shadows across Holmes's face. He sat with his hands clasped together, his fingers tightening slightly as the calculations in his mind grew sharper. Eleanor Henshaw had not been taken by force. That much was certain. The silk thread, the unlocked window, the carefully untouched room. Every detail pointed toward a deliberate escape rather than an abduction. And yet the presence of James Percival complicated everything. Holmes had encountered men like Percival before, men who orchestrated their crimes with the precision of a chess master, moving their pawns long before their opponents even realized the game had begun. If Eleanor had sought refuge with Percival, it was not by accident. It was an act of desperation. And desperation, Holmes knew, could be far more dangerous than malice. The carriage came to a slow halt outside a quiet row of buildings near the river, their windows dark, their doors closed, against the night. Holmes stepped down first, his eyes scanning the empty streets, noting the stillness that clung to the air. This was where the trail had led him. An unassuming warehouse along the Thames, one of many properties under Percival's quiet ownership. The location was deliberate, chosen not for its convenience but for its isolation. If Eleanor was here, she was meant to remain unseen, kept away from the prying eyes of the city. Holmes moved forward without hesitation, his footfalls muffled by the damp ground as he approached the heavy wooden door. He reached for the handle, testing its weight, feeling the resistance beneath his fingers. Locked. But locks, he knew, were merely obstacles, not barriers. He reached into his coat, retrieving a set of slender tools, his fingers moving with practiced ease as he worked at the mechanism. It was an old lock, sturdy but predictable, and within moments it gave way beneath his efforts. He pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, his movements careful, precise. The air within was thick with the scent of damp wood and the lingering remnants of smoke, the kind that came from oil lamps left burning too long. The space was large, cavernous, with crates stacked high against the walls, their contents unknown. Holmes's gaze swept over the room, cataloging every detail in seconds. There was no immediate sign of Eleanor, no sounds of struggle or distress. But there was something else, something far more telling. A single chair positioned near the back of the room, its surface worn, its placement deliberate. Someone had been here. Recently. He stepped further into the warehouse, his movements soundless against the wooden floor. He knew better than to call out. If Eleanor was here, she would not respond to a name spoken into the dark. She was hiding, and for good reason. Holmes moved toward the far end of the room, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of a nearby crate, feeling the dust that had settled unevenly across its surface. Then he saw it, a sliver of movement barely perceptible, a shadow shifting just beyond the stacks of crates. He did not react immediately, did not alter his pace. Instead, he continued forward, allowing his presence to settle into the room, waiting for the moment when fear would give way to recognition. Then she emerged. Eleanor Henshaw stepped out from her hiding place, her figure barely illuminated by the dim light filtering in through the high windows. She was thinner than he had expected, her face pale, her eyes wide with something that was not quite fear, but something close. She did not speak, did not recoil. She simply stood there, as if she had already anticipated his arrival. Holmes took a slow step forward, his gaze locked onto hers, searching for the answer that had eluded him since the beginning of the case. She had not been kidnapped. She had run. The realization settled into Holmes's mind with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Every detail, every contradiction had led to this moment. Eleanor had not fled into the night in fear of a stranger. She had fled to escape something far more dangerous, something that lived within the walls of her own home. Holmes did not ask why. He did not need to. He could see the answer in the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides, in the way her breath came just a little too quickly, as if she were bracing herself for a punishment that would never come. Watson stepped forward cautiously, his voice low, measured. Eleanor flinched at the sound but did not retreat. Holmes watched her carefully, every instinct screaming at him to consider the implications of what he had just uncovered. Reginald Henshaw had come to him with a carefully constructed tale of abduction, a story designed to lead him away from the truth. But the truth, as it often did, had found its way to him nonetheless. Eleanor's gaze shifted past him, toward the entrance of the warehouse, and for the first time, Holmes saw something else in her expression. Not fear, not relief, but something far worse. Resignation. Holmes turned sharply, his mind already calculating the next move, already anticipating the danger before it revealed itself. The warehouse door had not been left ajar when they entered, but now it stood slightly open, the faintest whisper of wind moving through the space, and with it came the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The realization struck him like a physical blow. They were not alone. Holmes did not waste time on words. He moved first, grabbing Eleanor by the wrist, pulling her behind him as he stepped back into the shadows of the room. Watson followed suit, his instincts sharp, despite the lack of clarity surrounding the situation. Holmes knew that they had been followed, that Henshaw would not have simply let them walk away from the estate without ensuring that the narrative remained intact. If Eleanor had been meant to disappear, it was not into the safety of another's arms. It was into silence. Permanent silence. A figure stepped into the warehouse, his movements deliberate, his presence a confirmation of every suspicion Holmes had harbored. A man dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by the flickering light. He did not speak. He did not need to. Holmes could see the intent in his posture, the way his hand hovered just beneath his coat, where the weight of a weapon undoubtedly rested. The game had shifted. The case was no longer about discovery, it was about survival. Holmes felt Eleanor press closer behind him, her breathing shallow, her pulse quick beneath his grip. He did not let go. He did not falter. His mind was already calculating the next step, the quickest route to escape, the ways in which he could turn the situation to his advantage. But there was no more time for deductions, no more room for hesitation. The moment had arrived, and the case that had begun with quiet lies was about to erupt into something far more dangerous, something Holmes might not walk away from. Sherlock Holmes did not hesitate. His mind worked faster than his hands, faster than the shifting shadows of the warehouse, faster than the breath that caught in Eleanor's throat as she clutched at his sleeve. He moved before the man at the door could reach for his weapon, before the hesitation of uncertainty faded into decisive action. He pulled Eleanor behind a stack of crates, pressing her into the shadows just as the first shot cracked through the air. The bullet splintered the wooden box inches from where he had been standing a second earlier. Watson ducked instinctively, his hand moving toward his own revolver, but Holmes lifted a hand. No gunfire, not yet. There was still a way out of this without falling into the violence they had been lured into. The man at the door did not move forward, nor did he fire again. Holmes could hear the slight shift of his stance, the way his boots scraped against the damp wood. He was waiting. He was not here to kill recklessly. He was here to send a message, to deliver something final. Holmes understood now. This was not a random enforcer, not some hired brute sent by Percival. This was a carefully placed pawn, one set into motion the moment Holmes had stepped foot into Henshaw's house. Reginald Henshaw had never wanted his daughter returned to him. He had wanted her found so she could be erased. And now, Holmes had made himself a liability in the process. He did not allow the realization to slow him. He reached into his coat, his fingers finding the metal edges of the small vial he had kept tucked away for years, its use always prepared but never necessary, until now. The bottle was cool against his palm, the chemical mixture within potent, effective. He pulled it free, rolling it between his fingers before calculating the arc and tossing it over the crates toward the entrance. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, and within seconds a thick white smoke exploded into the air, filling the space with a blinding fog. The hired gun cursed, his footsteps shifting back as the sudden cloud enveloped him. Holmes grabbed Eleanor's wrist and pulled her to her feet, his voice low and sharp in her ear as he urged her toward the back exit. Watson followed closely, his hand hovering over his revolver as they moved through the swirling mist. The back door was locked, but Holmes had already anticipated that. He pressed his shoulder against it, feeling the brittle age of the wood, the weakened frame from years of moisture and neglect. It gave way with a single forceful shove, the night air rushing in to replace the thick smoke behind them. The alley was empty, the city stretching out before them in all its indifferent vastness. Holmes did not stop. He pulled Eleanor forward, leading her through the narrow paths between buildings, his mind constantly calculating their next move. Watson followed silently, trusting Holmes to lead them away from immediate danger. The footsteps behind them faded, the sounds of pursuit lost in the chaos of the smoke still spilling from the warehouse. They reached the main street, slipping into the stream of late-night carriages and pedestrians moving through the city. Holmes did not stop until they reached an abandoned alley on the other side of the district, its darkness providing temporary shelter. Only then did he release Eleanor's wrist. Only then did he allow himself to assess the damage. She was breathing heavily, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress tightly, her entire body trembling from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Watson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but she barely noticed. Her eyes remained, locked onto Holmes, wide, searching. Holmes understood what she was asking without words. She had not expected to be saved. She had prepared herself for the worst, had accepted a fate that had been chasing her since the moment she had decided to run. Holmes saw the weight of it in her face, the exhaustion of a woman who had been living in fear for far too long. He knew what she was about to ask. He knew what she needed him to say, but for the first time in a long time, he found himself hesitating. The case had begun as another puzzle to be solved, another set of clues to be arranged into logic. But this was not a simple game of deduction. This was a life that had been played, with manipulated, used as a pawn in a war Holmes had only just begun to understand. Reginald Henshaw had known exactly what he was doing when he came to Baker Street. He had spun his web carefully, had used Holmes's own brilliance against him, had made him believe that finding Eleanor was the solution, rather than the beginning of a greater problem. And now, Holmes had only two choices: walk away and let Eleanor disappear into whatever refuge she could find or see this through to its bitter end. He made his decision before his mind had fully caught up with it. He turned away from Eleanor and stepped toward the street, his eyes scanning the buildings, lining the road. He was no longer looking for safety. He was looking for the next move. He knew how men like Henshaw operated. They did not simply accept failure. They adjusted. They found new ways to tie off loose ends, and Holmes had just made himself the most dangerous loose end of all. Watson watched him carefully, his silence heavy with unspoken questions. Holmes did not offer explanations. He did not need to. He only gestured for them to follow as he stepped into the street, his coat whipping behind him as he moved with the same determined precision that had carried him through every case before. But this time, something was different. This time, there was something heavier pressing against his thoughts, something more than deduction. Regret. He did not speak of it. He did not allow it to slow him. But it followed him nonetheless, a shadow that stretched long against the gaslit streets, a reminder that, for all his brilliance, for all his calculated logic, there were things in this world that could not be undone. He had saved Eleanor Henshaw's life, but he had not solved the problem. He had only postponed it, and deep down he knew that this would not be the last time he faced a case that would leave its mark. But for now, there was work to be done. There were answers still waiting to be found. And Sherlock Holmes, for all his regret for all the ghosts that lingered in the spaces between his thoughts, would not stop until he had found them.